Hi, I'm Prashant Faloria, and I'm a PM here at Google. I just wanted to introduce my friend Michael Schwarz. I'm very excited about introducing him. He's a really sort of multifaceted academic, an economist, has done work in areas like decision-making under uncertainty, economic reforms for Russia, and what's pretty close to our hearts, auction theory and the application of auction theory to online auctions. Michael has been a professor at Harvard in the economics department, is currently a fellow at the National Bureau of Economics Research, is also currently a scholar at UC Berkeley. Michael, probably his biggest claim to fame is that he got his Ph.D. from what I believe is the best doctoral program in the world, the Stanford Business School doctoral program, where he and I were office mates and roommates as well. And I think his other big claim to fame was that he hung out with academics like Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow and folks like that while working on his PhD. I think without any further ado, let me introduce Michael and welcome him to something that's very close to all our interests. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, a disclaimer about the first slide. The title of the paper is really not selling billions of dollars worth of keywords. I simply cut out the first part of the title that is irrelevant. Generalized second price auction, selling billions of dollars of keywords. So that's actually a typo, but maybe a Freudian slip. So I just kept the important part. This is joint work with two of my students, Ben Edelman and Michael Ostrovsky. Michael Ostrovsky just graduated last year. Now he's a professor at Stanford Business School, and Ben Edelman is still at Harvard. And let me give you a roadmap of the talk. So we will start out with a story of the evolution of the market for internet advertisement. Oh, thank you. So we'll start out with the story of evolution of the market for internet advertisement. Here I expect to be corrected many times because I'm sure you know the history of that market much better than I do, but we tried our best. Then we'll talk about the model of generalized second price auction, the rules of the auction. And again, probably most of you are very familiar with the way the advertisement is sold, so that would be quick. And then we'll talk about the equilibria in this auction. What should we expect? How would advertisers behave in that auction? I will describe a couple of solution concepts for this auction, one locally and with free equilibria, and the other is generalized English auction, which is essentially a model sort of isomorphic to generalized second price auction. So two different ways of thinking about sort of equilibrium behavior of advertisers in these auctions. So we'll see that this kind of auction that Google uses to sell advertisement has remarkable properties, such as it has for generalized English auction version of that mechanism, it has unique equilibrium, it has ex post equilibrium, however, it doesn't have equilibrium dominant strategies. And it has the same payoffs as a Vickery auction. And again, I'll talk later about what it all means. So I understand that most people here have very little or no background in economics and a lot of background in other things. So I'll try to make a talk accessible for everybody with sort of for people with various backgrounds. So let me start out with a few facts about generalized second price auction. So it's an auction mechanism used by, so different variations of those mechanisms are used by Yahoo and Google to sell billions of dollars worth of advertisement. That's, of course, you all know. There are also companies around the globe that are much, much smaller that also use similar mechanisms. Here's a curious comparison. Google and Yahoo market cap is over $125 billion. All US airlines combined is under $20 billion. And if you think that comparison is striking, well, it's not a strike. It's actually more striking than it seems, because I wrote this slide almost 6 months ago, and by now the market cap of Google and Yahoo combined is much, much more than 125 billion, and the market cap of all US airlines combined is now significantly less than 20 billion. I think it dipped under 15.
How much profit do they have?
US airlines?
Yeah.
Well, most of them have significant negative profits, but there are exceptions, Southwest being one and pretty much the only one. Well, I mean, it may sound funny, but airline industry is one of the few industries where basically for about 80 years straight, there are pretty consistent records of losses. So let me describe the rules of this. So first of all, let me ask you a question. How many of you know quite well the rules of the auction that Google uses for selling advertisement? Okay, so there are some people who know the rules, some people who don't. So let me describe the rules. So basically, it's pay-per-click pricing. So you pay per click. If your ad is shown and nobody clicked on it, you don't pay. High ad receive more clicks, and that's the reality. One bid, everybody submit one bid, and the ads are arranged on the page in order of bids, and the payment of each advertiser per click is not equal to his bid, but equal to the bid of an advertiser right below him. So that's a somewhat simplified model of the auction that Google uses. Google adjusts bids based on relevance and based on click-through rates. So you can think of this model that I described here as a model where we assume that everybody has exactly the same relevance and exactly the same click-through rate. Given that the ads are in the same position, you can easily drop those assumptions. Things would get slightly trickier technically, but really doesn't make any fundamental difference. So that's why I would simply assume that all advertisers, if they were in the first position, would get the same number of clicks. So note that, so the auction is a real-time auction, and advertisers can adjust their bids more or less at any time. And if you have only one slot, one advertisement slot, then this auction is equivalent to a standard second price auction. So you have one advertisement slot, so there would be only one advertisement whose ad would be shown, and he would be paying the bid per click of an advertiser with the second highest value. That's the second price auction, also called Vickery auction. If you have multiple advertisers and multiple slots, then it's no longer equivalent to a second price auction. That's why I call it generalized second price auction. It is also not equivalent to Vickery auction, as we will see later. And by the way, as a piece of sort of trivia, if you would read the Google description of the auction for advertisers, it sort of sounds like Google is using Vickery auction, which in fact is not correct. So perhaps you should fix your the web page description that you give for the advertisers. Not that they really know what Vickery auction is, but nevertheless. So here are a few unique features of the market for internet advertisement. First of all, bidding takes place in continuous time. And that's really an unusual feature because, for example, of course, there are markets like eBay where you can change your bid at any time, but it's not really bidding in continuous time. The object is going to be sold at, say, certain date, at certain hour, the object will be sold, and that would be it. So it's not like the object is sold in continuous time. You bid is continuous time, but sales are not in continuous time. So here, you're really selling a flow of goods. So it's really happening in continuous time. And whoever was the highest bidder, at this very second, his ad would be on top of the page. So that's an unusual feature. That's not a unique feature. For instance, market for electricity has a similar feature. You are delivering a flow of goods. And you could imagine a mechanism for selling electricity where you sell electricity in continuous time. But that's not how electricity markets work. Most of the electricity is sold with long-term contracts. So even though you could imagine a market for electricity where you're bidding for it in continuous time, and if you didn't bid high enough, you don't get your electricity. But most of the electricity is sold through long-term contracts. There are some spots markets that are sort of like continuous time markets. So the other very important and striking feature of the market for internet advertisement is that approximately marginal utility or the profit of advertiser per click stays roughly constant. So, for example, if you have a web store, and if your store gets, approximately $2 worth of profit for every click that they get, if they get 50 clicks, the profit on that would be $100 minus the cost of those clicks. If they get 500 clicks, the profit would be 10 times more, because there's really not that much of a capacity constraints for many web stores. So that's in sharp contrast with other markets. So for instance, in the market for electricity, yes, it's another good that you buy in continuous time, but certainly if someone were to tell you, hey, you can pay twice as much for your electricity and we will ship you twice as much electricity as we used to, you would not be thrilled about it. You wouldn't know what to do with twice as much electricity as you're currently buying. Right? Google wouldn't be interested in buying twice as much electricity for double the price as they're buying now. Right? You're just using as much as you need. With advertisement, most advertisers would be delighted to buy twice as much advertisement and pay twice as much because profit per click stays roughly constant. So that's what makes this market really unusual. The other thing that I really like and find fascinating about this market is that there is no obvious definition of a unit of advertisement. And in fact, although talking about units of advertisement is not a subject of this paper, it's the subject of another paper, it is an important and interesting question. How do you define a unit of advertisement? And I think a lot of things that would happen in this market in the future will change the way we think about the unit of advertisement. But for the purposes of this paper, I will just assume that a click is a unit of advertisement. But here I want to sort of emphasize how differently we can think about what a unit is. So from advertisers' perspective, transaction, sort of a relative unit is pay per transaction. Right? Because an advertiser doesn't care about how many times his ad was shown. What's important is how many trinkets you sold. So an advertiser would say, well, from my perspective, the end product is transaction. So let's price advertisement based on transactions. And there are certainly quite a few models of pricing of online advertisement where that is exactly what's going on. Advertisers pay per transaction. That happened to be not the dominant model of advertisement, but certainly used. Amazon, for instance, buys a lot of advertisement based exactly on that model, and it's not uncommon. From search engine perspective, the exposure is a relevant unit of advertisement. And the relevant pricing model is pay per exposure. And to some extent, one can argue that in spite of the fact that Google charges per click, implicitly Google really charges per exposure, because there's an adjustment for per click. There's an adjustment for click-through rate. So if your ad is being clicked 3 times more often than the ad of your competitor, that means that you pay per click 3 times less, other things being equal. So on some level, implicitly, on Google, you pay per exposure. Although it looks like to advertisers that they pay per click. With Yahoo, you truly pay per click, because those are the rules of their game. They do not adjust the price based on click-through rate. So the middle ground is sort of pricing model where you pay per click. And obviously, all 3 pricing models are widely used. And pay-per-click seem to be a dominant model, although you can argue that Google's model is sort of closer to pay-per-impression than to pay-per-click. This slide we can skip because everybody in this room knows what click-through rate is. And here I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of this market, which I find very interesting. So it's sort of like evolution versus intelligent design. So economists say that they believe in evolution, but they really like intelligent design much better. So if you look at the markets that economists like, they really like markets that were designed by smart people, preferably economists, and where there's solid scientific foundation for how to put the market together. And if you look at spectrum auctions, that's how those markets were designed. There were people who were pretty much experts in the area who sit down and try to figure out how to run that auction in an intelligent way. There are electricity auctions. Again, those are this is the market that was very much designed by experts with a lot of debate, with a lot of thought put into it. I'm not saying necessarily those markets were designed in the best possible way, but they certainly were designed intelligently, so to speak. There are other markets, and that's actually most markets, that evolved. that didn't intelligently emerge, but really evolved with people randomly experimenting and sort of converging to a certain framework. So for example, New York Stock Exchange is a market that very much evolved. It started out with a bunch of people trading stock on the street, and slowly they sort of experimented with different rules, the institutions emerged, and it's not like there was one person or a group of people who thought systematically how to best design it. So for example, if you look at medical residency match, and that's a market where if any of you have a partner or a wife or a sister who is in medical school, you probably know about medical residency market. In most labor markets, you graduate from school and you look for a job. Not so for medical doctors. You graduate from medical school, you apply for residency programs, you submit a ranking to the computer. You say, this medical school, this residency program is my first choice, second choice, third choice, and so on and so forth. Residency programs do the same thing. Those preferences are entered into a computer system, and the computer spits out the match. And you get a letter in the mail saying, congratulations, you got your fourth choice. That's where you will be a resident. And that's pretty much final. So that's how the market for medical residency match works today. And that market actually evolved over 50 years. And at first, the algorithm that they used for matching had many flaws. And little by little, they were changing it and tweaking it, and eventually converged to a mechanism that we know, that we later learn is sort of scientifically sound, more or less uniquely reasonable matching algorithm. Right? So here, evolution discovered things that could have been intelligently designed, but really weren't. So internet advertisement, I think, is a market that evolved. And probably most of you know the story of the evolution of this market, but perhaps some of you don't, and perhaps some of you can correct my mistakes in the way I described that story. So I think in 1994, history pretty much began, and it began with pay impression pricing. And at that time, there was no auction. Ads were sold on the phone, and even small contracts were large, thousands of dollars. Lots of haggling on the phone, keyword targeting wasn't available, and entry was slow and there was unused capacity. So then the generalized price auction stormed on the scene, and that was introduced by GoTo, later Yahoo, in 1997. And there it was pay-per-click for a particular keyword. So in fact, probably all of you know that GoTo originally wasn't combined with a search engine. The idea was that just advertisers would pay for placement on GoTo page, and presumably those who are willing to pay the most per click are the most valuable for users. So it was sort of an attempt to create advertising search engine that was only later combined with a real search engine when GoTo was acquired by Yahoo. And that was really a revolutionary change. First of all, it allowed for much better targeting and much smaller contracts than you can do with haggling on the phone. Second, it was sort of allowed for experimentation by advertisers, because you can bid very, very small amount, experiment with one keyword, move to another one, and so on and so forth. And of course, Overture was fantastically successful, acquired by Yahoo, later became a platform for MSN. However, as successful as generalized first price auction was, by the way, let me describe what generalized first price auction was and how it differs from second price auction. In the generalized second price auction, you don't pay your bid per click, you pay the bid below you. So if you're number 5, you pay the bid of the person number 6, and you get the 5th spot. In the generalized first price auction, if your bid is bid number 5, you get the 5th slot on the page, but you pay your bid. So that mechanism was fundamentally flawed. And it's very easy to show that that mechanism has no pure strategy equilibrium. So let me illustrate what are the kind of problems that you can run into with a mechanism like that. So if you have so this is the chart of top bid over time for a specific keyword for July 18, 2002. And here we have data for every 15 minutes. And there are two advertisers that are alternating between having the highest bid. And this is what's happening with those bids, right? Over time, the top bid goes up, 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 down, up, up, up. Sorry. The bid goes up, and then suddenly it drops, and then it keeps going up. So you wonder what happens over time if you take a long period of time. Well, that's what happens. The top bid goes up, down, slowly climbing up, suddenly dropping down, and then once in a while there's a ziggle. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, this is just an example, but there are a lot of keywords. So we got a little bit of data that was kindly provided to us by Yahoo for the year 2002 when they used generalized second price auction, generalized first price auction. And those are the kind of bidding patterns you find there all the time. So what's really happening there is the following. You're paying your own bid. So suppose that you are the highest bidder and you bid 50 cents. The other guy bids 30 cents. You think, oh my God, I'm so silly for bidding 50 cents. I better bid 31 cents and I could still be the #1 bidder. So you reduce your bid to 31 cents. So now the guy who was the second highest bidder with a bid of 30 cents, he says, why should I occupy the second spot for 30 cents if for 32 cents I could be #1? So he increases his bid to 32 cents, and that's what you see here. Then I think, wow, why should I be the second highest bidder for 31 cents if for 33 cents I could be #1? So every 15 minutes, one of those guys increases the bid by a penny or by the minimum increment until one of them reaches the threshold that he's no longer willing to pay that price. He said, why wouldn't I bid very, very little and just be #2 but pay a very small amount? And then the other guy immediately realizes and the price drops like a rock. And of course, those are not human beings thinking that. They wrote simple robots, and those are the robots that they used. So clearly, this was not a good outcome. It was not a good outcome for 3 reasons. First of all, if my value for being the top advertiser is higher than yours, it's much better if I'm always the first guy, as opposed to when we try to game each other's systems. Second, it's not a good thing when people start investing a lot in those robots that try to game the system. So by the way, how much time do I have? 30 minutes, okay. So you can see that generalized first price auction had this problem, very unstable bids. And that when generalized second price auction was invented, I believe it was invented in 2002 by Google, and I think it was invented pretty much by accident. I heard different stories about how it happened, but it certainly wasn't a very complex, thoughtful process, but it was a success. Bids, once you start paying the bid of a person below you, there's much less reason to have your bid jumping around. So once it was introduced, bids became more stable, and it was an improvement, and Yahoo very quickly followed the suit after Google introduced generalized second price auction. So let me here describe sort of the comparison between generalized second price auction and VCG. So from Google's web page, here's a quote. Google unique auction model uses Nobel Prize winning economic theory to eliminate that feeling that you have paid too much. So that's Google web page, and then suggests to search for the word vicary, who is of course the person who got the Nobel Prize for sort of developing vicary auction. So interestingly, and in fact it's true that in a vicary auction, it's the best strategy for an advertiser to bid his true value. Not so in the auction, in generalized second price auction. So let me give you a simple example that illustrates that bidding your true value, so you have a certain value per click, the profit that you generate per click. So in generalized second price auction, if you bid your true value per click, you always pay less than that, right? You pay the bid of a person below you, so you get some profit. So is it always an equilibrium? Is it always the best strategy for an advertiser on Google to bid his true value? The answer is of course not. Let me give you a simple example that illustrates this point. Suppose there are only 3 advertising slots, and suppose that the click-through rate for at the first slot is 100 clicks per day. And at the second slot, suppose that the click-through rate is 99 clicks per day. So of course, in reality, it's not really true. The second slot would probably get you more like 80 clicks per day if the first one gets 100. But just for the sake of example, imagine that those are very similar. So now, suppose that there are only 3 advertisers, and one of them has a value of $100 per click. The other one has a value of $99 per click, and the third one has a value of 5 cents a click. So if everybody bids truthfully, the guy with the highest value gets the first slot, he gets 100 clicks, and he pays $99 for each click. So he only makes $1 profit on each click. The guy in the second position, he only pays 5 cents per click, and he got 99 clicks. So he makes over $98 of profit on each click. So the guy in the first position could reduce his bid by a couple of dollars and get the second position where he would lose 1 click. Instead of 100 clicks, he would get 99 clicks, but instead of paying $99 per click, he would pay 5 cents per click. So clearly this is not an equilibrium for everybody to be bidding the true values, because if everybody were, the person with the highest value would be much, much better off not bidding his true value. Right? So it's a simple example that illustrates that truth-telling is just not going to be an equilibrium here, or not necessarily going to be an equilibrium. Well, if truth-telling is not an equilibrium, then what is? And how we can compute the equilibrium in this auction. So here I just formally describes the rules of generalized second price auction used by Google. Sort of economists like an auction mechanism called VCG, named after Vickery, Clarks, and Grove. That auction could have been used by Google and Yahoo. It's not, but it could have been. So here's how that auction works. And I will not describe the rules of the auction, but in a nutshell, I will describe the idea there. So it is similar to, it's adapted for environments similar to the one used by Google and Yahoo. You have a number of objects that you want to sell. So in the case of Google, you can sell multiple links on the page. And with VCG mechanism, each advertiser specifies his value for each of those objects. And then according to some pretty complicated formula, we can compute how much each of them should pay and what object each of them would get. So the remarkable property of this formula of VCG auction, and I wouldn't tell you what that formula is, but it has a remarkable property that it is in the best interest of every market participant to truthfully state his value for the object, for each of the objects. And that's sort of a remarkable property, right? Because most of the time, when someone asks you how much you're willing to pay for this, you don't want to tell the truth, right? You're hoping to get it for cheaper. So there, the formula is adjusted just right, so that if you exaggerate your value, you get penalized because sometimes you get the object, but you pay too much and you regret it. So you don't want to exaggerate your value. And if you understate your value, you also suffer because sometimes you don't get the object when you really would like to at the price that was available for you. So the best thing you can do under VCG is actually be truthful. And we already have seen that in the auction, in generalized second price auction, being truthful is not necessarily the best strategy. So we can compute what would be the revenues of Google under VCG mechanism, given the values of all advertisers, right? Given that we know the probability distribution from those, which those values are drawn. And probably all of you are thinking, well, what would be the revenue comparison from using VCG versus from using generalized second price auction in Google use? Which one is going to be more profitable for this company? And this paper gives an answer. And the answer is, it's the same. So let me describe two ways of thinking about the equilibrium in generalized second price auction. So one way to think about it is to think of generalized second price auction as a static game where, and by static game, imagine that we just play this game once, that we don't change our bids every second, but we sort of play this game once. And we think about what would be the reasonable strategies for people to use. There are many equilibrias in this game. It's easy to see that there are multiple equilibrias, especially if we know each other's values. So first of all, is it reasonable to assume that each advertiser knows the values of other advertisers? And I think it is reasonable, because in reality, this is a dynamic game where you play it every day, every second, every minute. And you can observe bids of other advertisers. On Yahoo, on Google, you couldn't observe bids of other advertisers, but you can experiment with your bid, and you can see what position on the screen you get by changing your bid. And that should tell you what the bids of other advertisers are. There's some noise, but you sort of get the idea. So as a result, since you essentially implicitly know you can infer the values of other advertisers, it sort of makes sense that whatever you are doing is the best response to what everybody else is doing. Why? Well, because even though we are modeling it as a static game, we also know that really it is a dynamic game where people could experiment over time and change their bids, so their bid should be a best response to bid of other people. And that's because they had a lot of time to experiment and to make sure that the bid is the best response of other people. So in some sense, what we are trying to do here, we are trying to figure out what would be the vector of bids to which we would eventually converge when advertisers are done learning about each other's values. So that's one restriction we want to impose. Right? All bids are best response to other people's bids. In other words, no advertiser could change his bid and as a result increase his profit. Pardon me?
That does assume equilibrium exists.
Yes, that's a very good question. So it certainly does assume that they exist in equilibrium in pure strategies. And later on, I will show that it does exist. So here you can say, assuming that there is an equilibrium where prices stabilize, and we saw that, for example, in generalized first price auction, that does not exist in equilibrium where prices stabilize, neither in theory nor in practice. So here, assuming that there is an equilibrium exists where prices do stabilize, we want to figure out what are the properties of this equilibrium, and later on I will show that it does exist. So everybody plays best response. The other requirement that I want to impose is locally envy-free equilibria. And that's what I mean by that. No advertiser envies the advertiser who is in the position right above his. So what do I mean by that? It means that if I'm an advertiser with a certain bid, and I am offered somehow to change places and bids with an advertiser who has a bid right above me, then I will choose not to do that. I don't envy him. So of course, in reality, it's not necessarily an option for me to go to the guy and say, how about you bid what I was bidding, I bid what you are bidding. That would be fair, right? No, right? I don't have this option. So why do I think local envy-freeness is a reasonable restriction? So here's why. Suppose that I envy the guy right above me. So I really would like to change places with him. So if I envy him, why not increase my bid by 1 penny? If I increase my bid by 1 penny and the other guy, the guy above me, didn't react to that, then my payoff is exactly the same because the payment that I make on the generalized second price auction doesn't change. So if I increase by my bid by 1 penny, the guy above me doesn't respond. Obviously, nobody else even noticed because they're not affected by the change. Then it's a wash for me. It doesn't matter. Now suppose that the guy above me reacts to that. How could he react? He dips below me, right? He reduces his bid so that he's right below me. So then my payoff is as if I changed places with him. Because now I'm paying exactly the same or 1 penny more than what he used to be paying. And I was envying him. So then it's almost like a dominant strategy. I'm using this term loosely. It's not really a dominant strategy. But in spirit, it's a dominant strategy for me to increase my bid 1 penny by 1 penny by 1 penny slowly over time up to a point where the guy above me, where I no longer envy the guy above me. And since it's almost a dominant strategy for me, you would expect that that's what would occur when the price vector stabilizes. So there are two restrictions.
Envying the guy below you. So the example you gave earlier, the case was that the guy who was paying the $100 or the $99 wanted to drop down to second.
Yeah. So here, the guy below you, if I increase my bid a little bit, the guy below me, his payment doesn't change, and his opportunities for changing his position worsen. Because now, if he wants to get my position, he actually has to pay one penny more than he used to pay in the past. So it's hard to imagine that as a result of me increasing my bid by 1 penny, the guy below me would want to increase his bid. There's no reason for him.
Yeah. What about decreasing your bid?
Pardon me?
Why wouldn't the top person decrease their bid?
As a result of what?
Because they envy the person below them.
The top person would never envy the person below him because he can always decrease his bid. I'm worried about the person who is, say, number 3 on the page envying the person number 2 on the page.
Why don't you have to worry? I don't understand why you don't have to worry about the opposite.
So the opposite, so let's see. Let me show that the restriction that all bidders play best response to each other's strategy guarantees that nobody envies a person below him. So suppose that you bid 50 cents and the person below you is at 30 cents. And you envy that person. So you envy the person who is at 30 cents. What does that person pay for click? Well, he pays per click whatever is a bid below him, say 10 cents. So you envy a person below you who is currently bidding 20 cents, and that's what you're paying, and he's paying per click 10 cents because he's in the second position. So you can always reduce your bid so that you're a little bit below that person. And now you are paying 10 cents per click. Right? So if you are envying that person, you will take actions. You would be right below him immediately, and that would increase your payoff. So you would not be envying him, because there's not always an action available to you, so that you essentially switch places with him.
So by definition, if it's your best response, then you don't envy the person below you.
That's correct. But you still might envy a person above you, and we sort of argued a minute ago why that shouldn't be the case. So then we show that there is a special locally envy-free equilibrium where payments coincide with payments under VCG, under Vickery auction. And this equilibrium is the worst equilibrium for the seller, and this is the best equilibrium for advertisers. And revenues in locally envy-free equilibrium of GSP are at least as high as under VCG. So you see that we argue that given the auction mechanism that Google uses, there is a set of equilibria that satisfy locally envy-freeness, and the worst of those equilibria for Google is the one that gives the same revenues as VCG. So that's pretty good, and all other ones are better. So then the question is, okay, which of those equilibria is plausible? So unfortunately for you, the plausible one is the one that gives exactly the same revenues as Vickery auction. And here's why. And by the way, this is characterization of strategies. So here here B corresponds to bids of advertisers, and PV is the payment of bidder J under VCG, and it turns out that there is a very simple characterization of bidding strategies where you get pure strategy equilibria, and sort of your question of existence of equilibria pretty much answered by this formula. One can play around with it and make sure that nobody would have an incentive to change the bids given that the strategy is followed. Here's the so now let me, so I have what, about 15 minutes left? Huh? 10, 15, okay. So now let me move on to generalized second price auction and generalized English auction. And that's another way of sort of thinking what the equilibrium in generalized second price auction is. So note that I sort of described vaguely plausible restrictions on what the equilibrium in generalized second price auction should be, but I didn't describe how we can converge to that equilibrium, which is very important. And that, I think, sort of if we could describe a rule, sort of a behavioral rule that leads to convergence to that equilibrium, that I think would make it much more compelling that, in fact, that equilibrium obtains. Of course, it would make even more compelling that that's the equilibrium that people play to look at Google's data, but I'm in no position to do that, and I know that Hal did a lot of work on that, and in fact, we sort of independently get very similar results here, so I presume that Hal knows the answer regarding if this theory really works or not, and he wouldn't tell me. So, thank you. So here's a model, another model of the auction, generalized second price auction, that I think makes it sort of pretty intuitive how people would behave in this auction. So here are the sort of rules of generalized English auction. So imagine if you have a clock, and on that clock you see the price. And everybody sort of comes into the room. So this is a metaphor for generalized second price auction. Everybody comes into the room and they watch the price. And that the price on the clock is the price that they're willing to pay per click. Or more precisely, the price on the clock when you press your button, everybody has a button in front of them, is the price that they're willing to pay per click. And in a second, I will explain why this metaphor, I think, relevant and why it works. So if you press your button at time 0, the price is 0, and you're not participating. Your bid is 0, you're not getting anything. If you press your button at price 1 cent, then you're bidding 1 cent per click. If you wait and you press your button at 20 cents per click, then your bid is 20 cents per click. And also imagine that everybody sees when someone presses a button. So that's observable. So first of all, why is it even a reasonable model? So I think it's reasonable in the following sense. Suppose you have a new keyword, and a bunch of people start bidding on that keyword, and currently nobody is bidding on it. So what do you bid? You bid the minimum bid. You bid, 5 cents. So then someone else comes in and bids 6 cents. So now suddenly you're number 2. So you think, well, is it worthwhile for me to be number 1 at 5 cents, number 2 at 5 cents, or should I bid 7 cents and be number 2? Well, I will bid 7 cents maybe if my value is high enough. And someone else comes in and says, oh, I want to be at this price, I want to be second. So everybody sort of incrementally increases the bid 1 cent at a time, and we sort of go around increasing our bids 1 cent at a time until some of us says, well, it's not worth it for me to keep increasing the bid. So it's a very intuitive procedure. And it sort of makes sense to model this procedure with this clock, because us taking turns increasing our bid 1 cent at a time until we feel that clicks got too expensive, so it's not worth increasing our bids, is sort of mathematically equivalent to us pressing a button on the clock when the price reaches the price point where we are no longer willing to increase our bids. So here's what's interesting here. In generalized second price auction, in generalized English auction, we can prove the following theorem. There is unique perfect Bayesian equilibrium. So if you don't know what perfect Bayesian equilibrium, it doesn't matter. Just say unique equilibrium, the only thing that could plausibly happen. There is a unique equilibrium in generalized English auction. And in that equilibrium, it would have to be the case that everybody drops out at a price that is essentially that is sort of a slightly complicated function of bidders' values and of click-through rates. So alpha k here is click-through rate, si is bidder's value, and b is the bid of bk plus 1 is the bid of bidder in position k plus 1. So it's a pretty simple recursive formula that characterizes the bids of every player, the prices at which people would drop out, as a function of values of players, click-through rates, and bids of other players who dropped out before a given player. So this recursive formula allows us to compute the revenue. And we know this formula characterizes unique equilibrium of generalized first price auction, of generalized English auction. So what's remarkable here, that in this equilibrium, everybody receives the same payoff as under VCG. And VCG is that remarkable auction that I described before, the auction that won Nobel Prize for Vickery, and when everybody has an incentive to bid truthfully. So here you get exactly the same revenues. And what's really remarkable, in my opinion, is that in this equilibrium and generalized English auction, bidding your true value, dropping out at your true value, is not an equilibrium strategy. You don't want to drop out at your true value. You drop out earlier. But what's remarkable that in spite of the fact that there's no dominant strategy, your dropout time depends on values of other people who dropped out before you. Nevertheless, there's unique equilibrium, and that equilibrium is ex post. So what does it mean that an equilibrium is ex post? It means that even if you would have known in advance the values of all other bidders, you would act exactly the same way. So if, for instance, before the auction I were to ask you, do you want to tell the public what your value is? And you'd say, yeah, it's no secret. I don't mind other people knowing it because that wouldn't really change their actions. At the same time, so obviously in any mechanism that's dominant strategy implementable. If there's an equilibrium in dominant strategy, what does it mean? It means that I have a strategy where whatever I do, whatever other people do, I know what I should do regardless of the actions. So that mechanism, of course, would be ex post mechanism, right? Because I don't even care what other people's actions are. I still want to, go right, regardless of what they do. So that's dominant strategy. Here, there are no dominant strategies, but there's still an ex post equilibrium in the sense that the outcome that obtains in the game doesn't depend on my beliefs about values of other people. Yes? Yeah. So let me describe the intuition behind this theorem. And I think I have about 5 minutes left, and that's exactly the right amount for describing the intuition. So the proof is quite complicated and convoluted, but the intuition is, I think, crystal clear and also simple enough that I think even advertisers can figure it out. So here's how the intuition works. Suppose that there are only, say, 2 slots and 3 advertisers. And suppose that advertisers have values 10 cents, 30 cents, and 50 cents. So now we started our clock. So the price reaches 5 cents. Does anybody want to drop out? Well, the guy with the value of 10 cents think, well, if I will drop out, I will not get a slot. So it's a dominated strategy for me to drop out because there's a chance that someone will drop out between now and 10 cents, in which case maybe I can get a second slot for 7 cents, which is better than nothing. So the last guy keep going until 10 cents. At 10 cents, he thinks, well, gee, nobody dropped out and it's already 10 cents. So if I will go to 11 cents, that's really bad, because if I go to 11 cents and someone drops out at 11 cents, I will end up paying 11 cents per click for clicks that are worth 10 cents for me. So it's very obvious what the last guy will do. The last guy will drop out at his true value. And if his value was 10 cents, he will drop out at 10 cents. And that's what this formula says. So now we have 2 guys left in the running. One dropped out at 10 cents, and the other guy has a value of, let's say, 30 cents and 50 cents. So now there is a 30-cent guy, and he could say, well, now I could drop out at 11 cents. If I drop out at 11 cents, I will get the second slot, and say I get 10 clicks, and I'll pay 10 cents per click, which is pretty good. On the other hand, if I increase my bid to 12 cents, then there's a chance that nothing would happen between 10 cents and 12 cents, in which case I still have an opportunity to get the second slot and still pay 10 cents per click. But there's something else that could happen. Maybe the other guy will drop out at 11 cents, in which case I will be number 1 person, and I will be paying 11 cents per click. So then his decision problem is, well, let's take it 1 cent at a time. What's better, being number 2 and paying 10 cents a click, or going down up to 12 cents and running a risk of being number 1 and paying 11 cents a click? So depending on click-through rates and the values, you can write a formula and you can say, well, regardless of what would happen, if the other guy drops out, or if the other guy doesn't drop out, I'm at least as well off going to 12 cents, right? So he would increase his bid. So then he would reach a point, say 15 cents, where he would be exactly indifferent between getting the second place for 10 cents or getting the first place for 15 cents. I call it a magic point. So why is that point a magic point? Because at that point, that's also an envy-free point. Because at that point, he says, if I go to 16 cents and the other guy drops out, then I'm not really a big winner. Because if I go to 16 cents, the other guy drops out at 15, yeah, I get slot number 1, that's cool, but I'm also paying 15 cents. Well, if I'll drop out now, I'll get slot number 2, but I will be paying only 10 cents. So I'm indifferent between those two things. Okay. So if you go anywhere higher than the magic point, then in fact winning becomes a curse. You're worse off winning. You don't want the other guy to drop out. So you couldn't win by increasing your bid. So it's sort of like a dominated strategy here to keep increasing your bid. In fact, it is a dominant strategy. So as a result, we know exactly when the second person drops out. That's when basically he says, look, the current price for the second spot versus getting the first spot at my bid, I'm indifferent. So I will drop out here because there's no economic sense for me to increase my bid. So this argument actually tells you that there's a dominant strategy equilibrium where you get sort of very clear what the outcome would be, right? We know where the second guy drops out. He drops out before his value, and we know when it will be. If you have instead of 3 advertisers, 10 advertisers, then exactly the same reasoning holds. And strictly speaking, it's no longer technically a dominant strategy equilibrium, but it's exactly the same logic. You keep dropping out when basically you no longer want to win at the going price. And that's, I think, a very compelling argument that sort of nails what the equilibrium is, and that's exactly the same equilibrium that we were getting as envy-free equilibria. So I think that's sort of a pretty compelling prediction. So instead of a conclusion, I'd like to say that it's particularly interesting that this mechanism, the mechanism that Google uses, which is, I think, a sort of mechanism with beautiful properties, right? You get this very nice equilibria where your bid depends on bids of other people, but at the same time there's unique equilibrium. It doesn't matter what you think about the distribution of values of other people. It has all those nice theoretical properties, uniqueness, ex post equilibrium, the same revenues as VCG mechanism, and yet it really evolved. It somehow, as a process of experimentation, that where sort of you arrived. So as an economist, I find it fascinating. That's not to say that this mechanism couldn't be improved. Of course, in the framework of this paper, there are a lot of issues like advertisers' incentives for truthfulness in ads, like stability with respect to fraudulent clicks, like giving sort of value to people who click on ads. Of course, all of that is outside of the framework of this paper. And I think sort of you could imagine mechanisms that would address those issues as well. And I think that's also fascinating. And I'm looking forward to seeing other mechanisms coming out from Google. So thank you very much for your attention and for an opportunity to give a talk to this wonderful audience.
Externality, so the idea being that the R should be externality forced by that. So how would that be? I didn't see that the R should be. So is that incorporated into the technical?
Yes, it turns out.
Question, please. Did you repeat the question?
Yes, so let me try to repeat the question. We'll see if I understand it correctly. So you mentioned that in the paper I talk about VCG as a mechanism where by design every player makes a payment that's equal to the externality that he imposes on other advertisers. Here the question is, does generalized second price auction do the same thing? And the answer is yes. It turns out that, for instance, when you look at the model of generalized English auction, which is basically equivalent to generalized second price auction, there the payments are exactly the same as at VCG, and that we showed. And that's why it has to be the case that those externalities were also internalized in exactly the same way, because you pay the same thing at the end of the day. So the reason why it happens may be a little bit less intuitive, right? Because in VCG we explicitly constructed a mechanism where your payment was computed so that you will pay exactly the amount of externality you imposed on other people. Here, the mechanism is constructed in sort of very simple ad hoc way. Just pay the price per click of the person below you. So why would that mechanism somehow miraculously internalize all externalities? And the intuition is simple. It turns out that you essentially internalize the externalities when you're exactly indifferent between switching places with the person above you or below you at the going price. And since we show that sort of your equilibrium behavior here is that you want to drop out, and that's in your interest to drop out right at the point of indifference for you, and that's why there happen to be this equivalence between those two mechanisms.
The victory options actually depend on, or the mechanism depends on the number of clicks at each slot. Whereas, to some extent, if you look at the second price option, you don't care about the number of clicks at each slot, it's what the per click basis. But I guess the point of indifference between the no-envy aspect sort of covers the fact that the slots can have different number of clicks on a per day or per hour basis.
Right, right. So if you want to think of it as sort of in the language of Vickery auction, then you have to think about not selling clicks, but selling, say, 10-minute intervals, and you know by experience that in 10-minute intervals there would be 20 clicks. So you sort of could think of the first position for 1 hour as a bag of 20 clicks, and the second position for 1 hour as a bag of 15 clicks, or something like that. And then you can sort of seamlessly use Vickery framework. So this.
You mentioned that Google sort of stumbled upon this by accident. I think it'd be fair to say that necessity is the mother of invention, and there were two dominant principles at work when we designed AdWords. One of them was the ranking by sort of a revenue quality function, and the other one is that the advertiser gets the best value. And those things combined led to the type of thing we invented.
So do all these results require that the relative values of the slots be identical for everybody? I mean, does everybody's valuation function have to just sort of be a constant multiple of each other?
Yes.
Okay.
So the results of hinge on the assumption that everybody has a certain value per click, and then the difference in positions is how many clicks you harvest. And of course, in reality, that's not entirely true. And
is there sort of any slot before it becomes unstable again, or is it?
That's a good question. I don't know. I can tell that. So you
Yeah, I know the answer to that. Actually, if you replace the value times the clicks from the position by just a general VIJ, the value of advertiser I being in slot.
Oh, that works.
That works fine.
That's right. That's right. I thought the question there was, what if your value for 10 clicks is not equal to is not twice the value for your 5 clicks? I thought that was the question. And if that's true, then sort of things get messy.
But VCGs don't work.
Yes.
Okay, so you can have arbitrary monotonically increasing values, and everybody can be completely subjective on that. So so then you never have a case where you want to stay in because you really want first slot, but you don't want second slot. You don't like. I'm thinking of a case where sort of for me there's a huge value to first slot, but second slot would be a loss. So really.
But that would be the case, then you could model that with just the arbitrary VIJ. So say the value of advertiser I being in slot J, and all the theory works fine, except you don't get closed form solutions. You have to iterate, solve it in your program to get the outcome.
Okay.
But the theory works fine.
Does the generalized English auction result follow that too, probably, or?
No, I thought probably.
But there is an auction that does work that case.
I'm curious about the other equilibriums. How can you know if you are, how stable are these other equilibriums?
So if you are talking about generalized English auction, there are no other equilibria. So if you are talking about generalized second price auction, then there are plenty of other equilibria. So let me sort of give you a simple example, much simpler example, the particular case when you have just one object. So then generalized second price auction becomes second price auction, and generalized English auction becomes English auction. And the rules of the English auction are pretty much the same, right? You have a clock or auctioneer who screams out prices, and you sort of drop out at a certain price, and the other guy wins, right? So Sotheby could be thought of English auction. So there, if you look at second price auction, there are multiple equilibrias. There are tons of equilibrias. For example, suppose that my value is 5 and your value is 10. So is it an equilibrium? So certainly there is an equilibrium where I will bid 5, you bid 10, and I get the thing for, and you get the thing for $5. But there are other equilibria. For example, if I know that your value is 10, I could bid 0. And you would get thing for 0, which would also be an equilibrium. And there is another equilibrium where even though my value is 5, I bid 1,000,000, and knowing that I bid 1,000,000, you bid 0 because it's hopeless, right? So those equilibriums are not very plausible in some sense, because even though you know that my bid will be 1,000,000, why not bid $10, which is your value, so that I would pay at least $10 for being for the privilege of being a jerk, right? So in fact, bidding $10 is your dominant strategy in that case, since that's your value, so you couldn't lose by bidding that. So there's one plausible equilibria and many other equilibria. So here, when you look at English auction, it essentially has unique equilibrium. The word essentially is important. You need a little bit of sort of refinement, but subject to a little technicality, English auction would have a unique equilibrium. Why? Because, you know, I bid $5. My value is 5. Your value is 10. I bid $4. You say 5. What am I to do? To bid 6? I couldn't, because then I would overpay. So there, basically, you get uniqueness. So here, it's exactly the same relationship. Generalized second price auction, a large set of equilibrias. Generalized English auction, a unique one.